All right, let's get right into it, shall we? Today, we're diving deep into something that might just make you look at cityscapes a bit differently. We're talking about hostile architecture.
Uh-oh, sounds ominous.
Well, it kind of is. You know those weird benches you see sometimes, like the ones that are super slanted or have those armrests right in the middle?
Yeah, or those metal spikes you see on ledges. Always makes me wonder who they're trying to keep out.
Exactly. So are those just like bad design choices, or is there something more to it?
Actually, it's way more intentional than you might think. These designs are called hostile architecture because they're specifically meant to discourage certain behaviors, like loitering or sleeping in public spaces.
So it's not just about aesthetics, it's like a whole strategy to control how people use public areas.
Exactly. It's a way of shaping who gets to use those spaces and how.
Interesting. But also a little creepy when you think about it. Like, they're trying to manipulate people without them even realizing it. Where did this whole concept even come from?
Well, it goes back a ways to the 1980s and this theory called broken windows policing.
Oh, yeah, I remember learning about that. Wasn't the idea that if a place looks run down, it encourages more crime?
Right. The thinking was that visible signs of disorder, like graffiti or, homelessness, could lead to more serious offenses. So cities started designing spaces to, let's just say, encourage certain activities and discourage others.
So by making public spaces less welcoming to certain people, they thought they could reduce crime.
Yeah, in theory. But it obviously raises a lot of ethical questions, like who gets to decide what's orderly and who gets excluded.
It's almost like saying some people just aren't welcome in these spaces, which is pretty messed up. But are we talking about just a few weird benches here and there, or is this a global thing?
Unfortunately, it's way more common than you might think. And it's not just benches. We're talking about all kinds of designs, from spikes and barriers to even lighting and landscaping, and it's happening all over the world.
Wow, I had no idea it was so widespread. So what are some examples of, like, really blatant hostile architecture?
Well, I'm sure you've seen those photos of those metal spikes they put outside buildings in London.
Yeah, I remember seeing those online. Brutal.
Exactly. Those are a pretty clear example of how hostile architecture targets the most vulnerable, like folks experiencing homelessness. They're meant to deter people from sleeping rough, but obviously sparked a ton of outrage and debate.
Makes sense. I mean, it's a pretty dehumanizing way to treat people. What about other cities? What kind of hostile architecture are we seeing in, say, the U.S.?
Oh, plenty. Like San Francisco, for example, they have a huge problem with homelessness, and you see all kinds of hostile architecture there, like those slanted park benches that make it impossible to lie down.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those. It's like they want you to sit but not get too comfortable.
Right. It's all about control. You can be in the space, but only on their terms. Even something as basic as resting is being controlled.
In New York, what about the subways there? I feel like I've seen some benches that just look wrong.
Oh, yeah. You probably saw those benches with the super narrow armrests. That's a classic example of hostile architecture. They make it really hard to actually lie down or even spread out comfortably.
It's like they're actively trying to make these spaces uncomfortable for anyone who doesn't fit a very specific mold.
Yeah, you got it. It's about creating these unspoken rules about who belongs and who doesn't. And it often targets the most vulnerable, like folks experiencing homelessness, the elderly, anyone who might need to rest or use public space in a way that doesn't fit that narrow definition of, acceptable.
So rather than addressing the root causes of these issues, they're just making it harder for people who are already struggling.
Exactly. It's like sweeping the problem under the rug instead of actually trying to solve it.
And this isn't just happening in big, bustling cities, right?
Nope, it's everywhere. You can find hostile architecture in small towns, suburbs, pretty much anywhere you have public spaces. Yeah. Like even in Paris, the city of love. They have these benches in the Luxembourg Gardens with armrests right down the middle.
Wow, even Paris. I guess no place is immune to this.
I mean, the benches look beautiful and all, but they make it pretty much impossible to lie down. Raises questions about accessibility, too, not just for people experiencing homelessness, but for anyone who needs to stretch out or wants a place to rest, elderly folks, people with disabilities.
Wow, even taking a nap in a park is now being controlled by design. It's pretty disturbing when you think about it. But it makes me wonder, what's the psychological impact of all this? Like, if you're surrounded by these cues that you're not welcome, surely that has to mess with you on some level, right?
Absolutely. Living in an environment filled with hostile architecture can create a real sense of unease and anxiety. Imagine constantly feeling watched, judged, or straight up unwelcome in public spaces.
Yeah, that's got to be pretty demoralizing. Like you said, those spaces are sending a clear message. You don't belong here.
Exactly. And that can have a real ripple effect. It can create a sense of division in communities and reinforce the idea that some people are just more deserving of comfort and public space than others. It's fascinating, really, how something as simple as design can have such a profound impact on how we interact with each other and with our environment.
It's kind of a bummer, to think that these designs are actually making people feel worse. But it makes me wonder, is anyone, pushing back against this trend? Are there cities that are doing things differently, designing spaces that are actually welcoming?
Oh, absolutely. There are some cities out there that are really bucking this trend and coming up with some pretty amazing solutions.
Okay, tell me everything. Which cities are leading the way on this?
Well, Copenhagen's a great example. They've been doing some really cool stuff with their public benches.
Benches. How can benches be innovative?
Well, think about it. Instead of those narrow, uncomfortable benches, those Haas ones we talked about, they've designed these benches with built-in shelters. So you can actually rest without worrying about the elements or feeling like you're being watched.
So you can actually get comfortable, maybe even take a nap without being, shooed away.
Exactly. It's all about providing a sense of safety and dignity. It's like they're saying, hey, we see you and we want you to feel welcome here.
That's awesome. It sounds like they're actually trying to meet people's needs instead of just trying to, hide the problem. Are there other cities doing similar things?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Barcelona is another great example. They've been doing this really cool thing called adaptive reuse.
Adaptive reuse? What's that?
Basically, it's about taking unused or abandoned spaces and transforming them into something new. Like, instead of building new shelters, they might take an old building and convert it into a shelter or a service center for people experiencing homelessness.
Oh, that's smart. They're using existing resources and turning them into something positive.
Exactly. And it shows that there are other ways to address these issues. It's not just about hostile architecture or, doing nothing. There's a whole range of possibilities in between.
This is giving me hope. It seems like there's a movement towards a more humane and inclusive way of designing our cities.
Yeah, and it's gaining momentum. There's more awareness now about the problems with hostile architecture, and people are speaking out against it. Plus, you have more research coming out about the negative impacts of these designs, both socially and psychologically.
So it feels like we're finally having a real conversation about who these public spaces are for. And that brings me to kind of a big question.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, this whole thing about hostile architecture really comes down to this. Are public spaces meant for everyone? Or should they be designed to prioritize certain groups over others?
That is the big question, isn't it? What does it mean for a space to be truly public?
And there's no easy answer, right? I mean, you have to think about safety and security, too. But how do you balance those concerns with the right of everyone to access and use public spaces?
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure. But I think the key is to move beyond this idea that hostile architecture is just about preventing crime. It's so much more complex than that.
Because it's about social justice, right? It's
Yeah.
about how we treat each other, especially the most vulnerable among us.
Absolutely. It's about creating a society that's welcoming and inclusive, where everyone feels like they belong.
So it's not just about benches and spikes. It's about fostering a sense of community, a sense of belonging.
You got it. It's about creating spaces that encourage people to connect and just be themselves.
Or instead of those benches with the armrests, maybe we need more benches that invite people to sit and talk to each other. Instead of spikes and barriers, maybe we need designs that make people feel safe and welcome.
Exactly. It's about shifting our mindset. Instead of seeing certain groups as problems to be managed, we need to start seeing them as people with needs and voices that deserve to be heard.
And that brings us to this. What does this all mean for the future of our cities? Are we headed towards a world of more hostile environments, or is there hope for a more humane approach?
Honestly, I'm optimistic. As more people learn about the impacts of hostile architecture, I think we'll see a shift towards more inclusive designs.
Yeah, I'm seeing that already in some places.
Exactly. And I think that momentum is only going to build from here.
I hope you're right, because a world where public spaces are only accessible to a privileged few, that's not a world I want to live in.
No, me neither. We need to fight for public spaces that are truly public for everyone.
And I think the key is to keep talking about it.
Right, to keep the conversation going, to challenge the status quo, and to demand better from our cities. We need to start seeing design not just as a way to control behavior, but as a way to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
It's really cool to hear about those cities taking a different approach, actually trying to make things better. It gives me hope that we can build cities that work for everyone. But it also makes me think, like, what can I do? What can regular people do to make a difference?
That's a great question. And honestly, you don't need to be like a mayor or an architect to make a real impact.
So what can we do?
Well, first of all, just being aware of this stuff is
Yeah.
huge. Like once you start noticing how design can be used to include or exclude people, it's kind of hard to unsee it.
Yeah, like those benches we were talking about.
Exactly. So like start paying attention to the design choices you see around you in your own city. Ask yourself, who are these spaces designed for? Who might be left out?
Okay, so noticing these things is the first step. But what do you do with that awareness? How do you go from noticing to actually doing something?
We'll talk about it. Tell your friends, your family, post about it online. The more we talk about this, the more it becomes part of the conversation, and that can lead to real change.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about more concrete actions? Is there anything we can do to actually advocate for better design, more inclusive design?
For sure. There are groups out there working on this, pushing for change. You can support those organizations. You can even contact your local officials and tell them you care about this.
Oh, yeah, I guess we could write to our city council or something.
Yep. Or even go to a city council meeting and speak up during public comment.
Those are good ideas. I bet even just supporting businesses that are designing our spaces in a welcoming way could help too, right?
Absolutely. Money talks. When businesses see that people care about inclusivity, they're more likely to make changes.
And, it doesn't always have to be big things, like even just picking up trash in a park or offering to help someone who's struggling. Those little acts of kindness can make a difference.
Right, they totally can. It's about creating a better atmosphere, a more welcoming vibe, and it's something everyone can do.
Yeah, little things can add up. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. It was pretty eye-opening, It's made me think about how we design our cities in a whole new way.
Me too. It's been great talking about this.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you learned something too, and that you'll keep thinking about this, Keep an eye out for those hostile designs, but also look for the good stuff, the spaces that are truly welcoming. And most importantly, keep advocating for a more inclusive world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep fighting for better spaces for everyone.